The Witch That Got Her Wish. Written by James O. Williamson. Illustrated by Ravi Napalta. Dedicated to my daughters Alexis, Catherine, and Portia. Once upon a time, long ago, there lived a witch named Broomhilda. Compared to the other witches in the area, Broomhilda was the ugliest. She had a long nose with a hairy wart on the end. Her hair was stringy like straw. Her skin was all wrinkled. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her body was made like a sack of potatoes. Being so ugly was really to Broomhilda's advantage, because all the other witches believed that because of her ugliness, she was more powerful. All the people from the surrounding countryside avoided where Broomhilda lived like the plague. However, where Broomhilda lived was very beautiful. Broomhilda lived high on a grass-covered hill, filled with animals of all kinds. There was even a tall waterfall, which created the many scenic and fish-filled streams spreading throughout her land. The few hunters foolish enough to think they could enter her property undetected and hunt the animals on her land found out the hard way by being turned into stone that Broomhilda was not easily fooled. The animals were the only ones that Broomhilda had any real contact with. However, though she saved them from the hunter's arrow and their traps, they had to worry about her changing them into something other than what they were. Once a month, the day after the full moon, Broomhilda would turn one of the animals into something different. The other animals would then come and plead with her to turn them back. Many times she would, but sometimes she would not change them back right away. Last full moon, she had turned a rabbit into a head of lettuce. She did this to toy with the other rabbits and see if they would be tempted to eat him, but the lettuce was still there. Their friendship was too deep. As payment for her reversing a spell, Broomhilda would have the animals promise to do work for her. Some of the animals promised to clean her house, while others promised to work in her garden. Broomhilda was free to do nothing at all, while the animals did all her work. Broomhilda loved this arrangement, although the animals hated it. Broomhilda did this for two reasons. One, she believed, like everyone else, that because of her ugliness, even the animals were frightened by her looks. That is why Broomhilda kept some of the animals under a spell at all times, and used their friendship to keep the rest of the animals from leaving. Without the animals, Broomhilda believed that she would be totally alone. The other reason was, she's a witch. So on the morning after the full moon, the door of Broomhilda's house burst open, and there stood Broomhilda with a sinister smile on her face. She said, "I wonder who I will turn into what today?" As Broomhilda stood in the doorway, deciding which animal she would pick that day, all the animals began to run and hide. It wasn't safe for any of the animals until that unfortunate animal had been changed. As Broomhilda stepped off the porch, her foot landed on a log. Broomhilda fell forward, rolling all the way down the hill, landing upside down in the stream below. The animals, even in their fear, could not help from laughing at the sight of the witch rolling down the hill into the water. As Broomhilda righted herself, seeing the animals laughing at her, she went into a rage. "How dare you laugh at me?" she screamed. "How dare you?" The animals had never seen Broomhilda with this much anger in her eyes. Even when Broomhilda had changed one of the animals, she never looked this way. With a scream of rage, Broomhilda lashed out at everyone and everything. She turned the rose bush into a thorn bush. She turned the tall oak tree upside down so that the roots were above the ground and the leaves were in the ground. Turning, she saw a raccoon trying to hide in the bushes. She turned him into a stone. A deer tried to escape, but she turned her into a tree stump. Broomhilda looked down and saw her own reflection in the water. But in her rage, she didn't even recognize herself. Before she could realize that the reflection was her own, Broomhilda casted a spell on the reflection in the water. In the water sat a lady wearing the witch's clothes. But this lady was not Broomhilda. At first, all the animals seemed confused. Who was this lady and where was Broomhilda? The old owl was the first to realize what had happened. "Ooh, ooh," he cried. "Broomhilda, in her rage at us for laughing at her, must have accidentally casted a spell on herself." Try as she might, Broomhilda could not reverse the spell she had placed on herself. Sensing that her powers were gone, the once gentle and tame animals saw an opportunity to get back at the witch for all the years they had been mistreated. Slowly, they began approaching her. "Get back!" she screamed, but they kept coming. This time, it was Broomhilda's turn to see the anger in their eyes, and she was now the one afraid. Broomhilda had no choice but to run with the animals in hot pursuit. The whole forest seemed to come alive and help in the attack on Broomhilda. The animals pulled at her now loose-fitting clothes until she was running naked through the forest. Broomhilda was now getting a taste of what it must have been like for the animals when she had them afraid of her. With every step, she could sense their anger towards her. Long after the animals had stopped chasing her, Broomhilda kept running until she fell asleep, exhausted, under some bushes. The next morning she was awakened by the sounds of someone approaching. Fear filled her again. Was it the animals? Had they found her? Broomhilda looked up and was relieved to see it was a young man. As Broomhilda stood up, the bushes barely covered her naked body. The young man stood fixed as he gazed at Broomhilda. The sunlight on her blonde hair made it look like spun gold. Her skin was the fairest the young man had ever seen, and her eyes were so blue a man could swim in them and be lost. "You're beautiful," the young man finally said. Broomhilda looked around to see if the man was talking to someone else. "Are you talking to me?" she asked. "Yes, I am talking to you," the young man replied. This was the first chance that Broomhilda had to look at herself, and though she could not see her face, she could see that her body had changed. The young man gave Broomhilda his cloak and took her home to his father. Like the son, the father was also spellbound by her beauty. "You're beautiful," the father also said. Broomhilda was still confused until the father gave her a mirror for Broomhilda to see for herself. As she gazed into the mirror, Broomhilda saw that she was in fact beautiful, but she didn't know if this was a good thing or a bad thing. "You must be a princess," the father said, "for anyone with beauty such as yours surely must come from royal blood." It was decided by the father that the right thing to do was to take Broomhilda to see the king, for he would surely know of her family. The father hitched the horse to his wagon and, together with his son, journeyed off with the maiden to see the king. Within a few miles of their home, the father came upon friends working in the fields. All the men stopped their work to find out who the beautiful maiden was. The father told the story of his son finding the maiden in the woods, and that they were taking her to see the king to see if he knew of this beautiful maiden's family. All the men asked and were told that they could come along. Traveling a few more miles, they came upon a group of soldiers going in the opposite direction. As the wagon passed the men, each were so busy looking back at the maiden in the wagon that they collided into each other. They all questioned the father and son about the maiden and were told the son's story. The men asked and were told they could join the group. The now larger group continued their way to the castle. Traveling further, they soon passed a large group being led by a horse-drawn coach with a wealthy merchant inside. They too were stopped in their tracks, throwing the merchant about in his coach, as his coachman and everyone in the group looked backwards at the passing wagon and maiden. Again, the story was told, and they also asked and were told they too can follow the group. In fact, every man they passed on their way to the castle who gazed at the maiden was spellbounded by her beauty. They all asked and were told they can all follow the group. By the time they made it to the castle, the procession of people was so great that the king thought they were an attacking army and had called out for his soldiers. When the king and his soldiers saw the maiden, they were also all spellbound by her beauty. The king heard the father's story of his son finding the maiden in the forest, and like the father, the king was convinced she must be a princess. The king told the maiden she would be his guest until her royal family was found. Broomhilda had gotten so caught up in all the attention she was receiving that she had forgotten to tell anyone about herself. The men following them had asked questions only of the father and his son, who had told them what they believed her story was. But no one had ever asked Broomhilda anything. The idea that she could be a princess was absurd to her, and yet the attention she was receiving was more than she had even seen the king receive. Broomhilda knew she could not allow the men to continue thinking she was a princess, for sooner or later they would surely find out the truth. And yet she also knew she could not tell them the truth that she was Broomhilda, the witch everyone hated. Broomhilda felt it would be safer to say she was just a maiden lost in the woods, and that her name was Christina. But once they found out she was not a princess, all the men cheered. They looked to each other and said, "This means any one of us could now have a chance to win Christina's heart." As word of this beautiful maiden spread, men from far and wide came to see her. Once they gazed upon her, they too were spellbound by her beauty. Christina loved the attention she was receiving. Every day, a gentleman was taking her to buy clothes, food, and wine until she had no place to keep it all. Sometimes Christina would think back to herself as the witch Broomhilda and how she had to use spells on the animals to get her way. Now, it was her newfound beauty that was getting her things, far beyond her dreams even as a witch. The men began building homes, competing to see who could build the biggest or best house and offer it to Christina to hold all the gifts she was receiving. Soon, however, fights even began to break out over who would be the gentleman to escort Christina for that day. The king soon realized something had to be done. Since Christina came to the castle, all work had stopped. Even the guards that needed to safeguard the castle had stopped their duties. All the men just stood around, waiting and hoping for a chance to see the beautiful Christina. The king thought maybe once Christina married, that all the attention paid to her would stop. But how long would it be before this would happen? A week? A month? A year? The king knew if it took too long that his kingdom would fall apart. Christina had to marry, and soon. The king proclaimed, "Let word go out across the land that a great tournament will be held, and that the winner will have Christina's hand in marriage." All the men were overjoyed because they now knew that soon Christina would belong to one of them. On the day before the tournament, the town was packed, overflowing with knights and peasant men alike, all anxious to compete for Christina's hand in marriage. Men left their parents, their girlfriends, and even their wives to compete. Even the king was risking his kingdom to compete for Christina's hand. All the men gathered on one side of town to celebrate before the great tournament the next day. While the men gathered on one side of town to celebrate, their ladies gathered on the other side. The women had long guessed that Christina must be able to cast some sort of spell on their men, and they were not about to let them get injured or even killed in a tournament for her. They decided whatever the cost, they had to get rid of Christina. That night, Christina laid restless in her bed thinking, "I don't want to get married," she thought to herself. and I certainly don't like the idea of some man telling me who I am to marry. Christina also realized that even with all the material things she had gained, she was still not happy. Remembering how carefree she was as a witch, she missed it. As she thought more about the tournament in the morning, Christina realized, as the women from the town did, that many of their men would be injured or killed in the morning. Christina knew that throughout all her years as a witch, she had never killed anyone or anything. She had changed people into a lot of awful things, but in every case, she would change them back in time. It was also possible for people to figure out how to break her spell. With spells, there is always a way to break them. Sometimes it takes as little as a kiss from the right person or animal to do the trick. Christina could not, however, figure out how to break her own spell. Christina thought back to the animals and the years she had abused them. She remembered the anger she saw in their eyes as they chased her away, and wondered if they had caught me, would they had killed me? The word kill seemed to echo through her head. Sitting up in her bed, she thought, no one was worth killing or dying for, no matter what the prize. Then, like a blow to the head, it came to Christina. All this time it was not her that everyone loved. No one ever really just talked to her to find out what she thought about anything. Why, no one even cared if she was capable of doing anything for herself. They all just wanted to do everything for her. It was her beauty everyone was in love with, not Christina the person. Suddenly, Christina was sad, and all she wanted was to be back in the forest and back to being Broomhilda. This time, it would also be different. If the animals would forgive her, Christina would ask for their help instead of forcing them to give it. But as much as she wanted to return to being Broomhilda, she could not figure out how to do it. Christina did, however, know she could not let the tournament take place in the morning, whatever the consequence. In the morning, she was going to tell the truth about everything, that she was Broomhilda, the witch. It was, however, already too late, because the ladies from town were already breaking her door down. Christina tried to scream over their shouts and tell them that she was really Broomhilda and that it was an accident of her making that had turned her into the beautiful maiden. The ladies would hear none of it and came at Christina. Again, Christina's only choice was to run, with the mob of angry ladies in hot pursuit. All night long they chased Christina using torches to see by. Christina cried aloud, "Why is this happening to me again? Why can't I be my old self again?" Christina ran all night long until morning, not knowing where she got the strength. But while running through some bushes, she fell over a sleeping witch. Angrily, the witch got to her feet. She recognized the girl right away. "Welcome, my pretty," she said. "You must be the beauty all the men are so crazy about." "Yes," Christina cried, "but could you please help me and hide me from the angry ladies from the town?" "Help?" replied the witch. "Sure, I will help you, my pretty. I will make it so you will never have to worry about the ladies from the town ever again." At that moment, the ladies from town surrounded the witch and Christina. Christina tried to hide behind the witch. Seeing this action, the ladies moved the witch aside. "What are you hiding for?" they asked. "We are looking for Christina, not an ugly old lady like you." With that, the ladies were gone. Looking down at her hands, Christina could see that they had changed. The witch was beside herself with laughter as Christina walked over to the nearby stream. "You wanted help?" the witch laughed. "Well, I helped you. You ain't ever going to have to worry about those ladies or any other ladies ever again. I made you look like the ugliest person I know." Christina slowly looked into the water. Her beautiful blonde hair was like straw. Her skin was all wrinkled. Her eyes were all bloodshot. And yes, there was the long nose with the hairy wart on the end. Broomhilda was back. The witch was still beside herself with laughter when Broomhilda ran up to her, gave her a big kiss, and said, "Thank you very much," and ran off. The stunned witch scratched her head, sat down on the ground, and melted right away. Running back home, Broomhilda ran upon a hunter she had years before turned to stone. "Do I also have my powers?" she thought. She tried a spell on the stone, and the hunter was returned to human form. The hunter wasted no time in getting out of there, for fear that he might be changed into something else. But Broomhilda only laughed. She was feeling so happy. Broomhilda made it home very late that night. It felt so good to her, being able to sleep on her old, hard bed again. The anticipation of being back with the animals again was overwhelming to her. Broomhilda wondered if the animals would give her a second chance after all she had done to them. With her powers back, she did not fear them anymore, but more important was the fact that she did not want them to fear her anymore. For those animals that would stay, she would use her powers to protect them. Broomhilda could not wait until morning. The animals, however, had not gotten along that well without Broomhilda. After word was out that she was gone, hunters were coming daily to shoot them. They'd been lucky in so much that only the old owl had been killed. The animals had worked together, helping each other, but it had been rough. At first light, the door of Broomhilda's house slammed open, and an excited Broomhilda rushed out. Her excitement was suddenly shattered by the sight she saw. She looked out over her territory. There were hunters everywhere. From the deer to the fish in the stream, none of the animals were safe from their onslaught. Tears filled her eyes as she wondered what the animals must have gone through. The tears turned into anger, and as her anger grew, the sunny morning sky grew darker and darker. As her anger turned into rage, lightning and thunder filled the sky. "How dare you!" she screamed. Her words echoed through her land like a roar of thunder. All eyes turned to the top of the hill. "She's back!" they shouted. Dropping their weapons, they ran for their lives. Broomhilda ordered the lightning to strike at those who were striking at her animals. As the lightning struck around them, Broomhilda was heard saying, "Don't ever come back, for next time I will not be so nice." Her anger gone, the sky cleared, and the sun returned. As Broomhilda walked down from her house towards the animals, she removed the spells from all the animals that were still under one of her spells. Approaching slowly, Broomhilda told the animals how sorry she was for all that she had done to them, and then asked for their forgiveness. She promised them that things would be different, and from that day on, she would only use her powers to help and protect them. All the animals gathered around Broomhilda, and for the first time allowed her to touch and pet them. Broomhilda felt more love in that moment than all the time during which she was Christina. Broomhilda was so happy, and so were the animals, and they all lived happy ever after.